discussion leader, then panelists 12 to 15 minutes apiece, with 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. And I will extend time. We have time. And then questions from the live audience, no more than 30 seconds to a minute. If you need to, we can have you interviewed by Robertson outside. Something if you need to speak a little more. I'm just kidding. Questions from the Zoomed audience, also read by host master Andriy Dobryansky. And then with the how squared away, now I turn to our first speaker from Ukraine. I'm going to do it just very quickly and without reading his bio. I just simply want to say that Kryvdyk has gone through several variations of what someone can do as a true political and academic activist in Ukraine. He has served in various governmental functions, including being the senior staffer and senior advisor for the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, of the Verkhovna Rada, Andriy Parubin. He has had an active part in our Maidans. He has had an active part in shaping the intellectual landscape. He has actually also gone abroad. He's one of those who first was, before our soldiers were trained in the West, he was trained in the West in intellectual terms, and therefore can really put the matter the way he always does to a global audience. And now he's actually, that's, I guess I'm trying to get to that one. He's now served in the Ukrainian army. And I don't think I'm going to be revealing much, but he will in fact have a pretty high post in the next couple of months. Ostap, I hope you're there, and I hope that I haven't overdone this introduction, or maybe underdone this introduction. Ostap, are you ready?
Yes, I'm here. Дякую, пане Влодку. Thank you, dear Professor Zaryckyj, for having introduced me. I cannot turn on my camera because Zoom does not allow me. So if you're ready to have me on radio, I'm ready to speak.
You can.
Thank you. So it's an honor and pleasure for me to be with you today. Yeah, very good. I'm going to speak about three aspects. First, about memory as source of geopolitics. Second, memory as a reason for war. And third, on memory as current battlefield. And I will start with some of the quotes, and I'm sure you will recognize of who spoke of those quotes. First, never forget about your heritage. You are the heirs of the great Russia of the saint, of the rulers, of the Grand Russia, of Peter I, Catherine II, the empire, the Grand Empire, the enlightened empire of grand culture and grand humanity. Never deny this heritage. You are the heirs of the great Mother Russia. Move forward with this, and thank you very much. Thank you for your way of being Russians. Second quote, the relation of France and Russia, of Russia and European Union is absolutely decisive. I know one thing, which is that Russia is European very profoundly, and we believe in a Europe which stretches from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And the third rather short quote is, you can negotiate with the Russians. So the first quote is Pope Francis to the youth gathering in Russia on August 25th, 2023. Second quote is President Macron of France on August 19th, 2019, during the official visit of Putin to France. And the third quote, which actually goes broader with, I I will accept Russia's control of Crimea and I will block Ukraine out of NATO belongs to Vivek Ramaswamy, who is one of the Republican short runners for the primaries in Republican Party. What connects all of those three quotes? It is the lessons of history at their school. It is the picture of the world which they consume from their media. In case of Pope Francis, it is his education in Argentina, and it is his Italian media space, which, as media analysts will clearly tell you, is very pro-Russian. In case with President Macron, it is, of course, the old good education. And in case with Mr. Ramaswamy, it is the Indian information space in which he, as I reckon, still lives, seeing Russia through the eyes of the Indian media. I wonder if many of you did have the chance to watch the speech of Sergei Plokhy at Kyiv Mohyla Academy at the inaugural lecture where he was given the honorary professorship to Kyiv Mohyla Academy. Professor Plokhy spoke of Russia's style of warfare, which, in his words, is war against culture and it's war against history. It is, again, in his words, the way to weaponize memory in the very way in which post-Weimar Germany did it. So why memory in history is so important? Still, right now, ancient history remains as a universal explainer for legacy or longevity, and therefore seriousness, stability, and institutional capacity for the phenomena explained. And that longevity continues in modernity and seems to be a model for the future. So say, if something existed for 900 years, it is much more likely to exist for another hundreds and hundreds of years in the future. Academia is a base of thinking. It's a base for establishing the facts, the common sense, the truth. In long-term, academia educates the elites who later speak of Europe to Vladivostok. And elite universities educate school teachers who in turn educate the masses. Here, journalism is core to the mass discourse, and it defines political narrative of this momentum. So if we compare it to modern warfare, journalism to me is more of an infantry which controls the ground, and academia is more of the radio electronic warfare, which is somewhat invisible, but which is scanning the horizon and predefining the events which will take place on the ground a bit later. So some of the ways of using history as war. One of them is naming. Recently, there was a very good analysis at text.org UA website of the books on history, where they found that children's books in the UK, in the US, in Germany, include a lot of notions like Kievan Russia. So in this way, Russia seems to have existed since the 10th century at least. Therefore, Ukraine, as a country which emerged briefly in media in early 20th century, in which did not have a continuous statehood, looks like an anomaly. And what starts with the children's books continues into the adult life. The way history is weaponized is often used into today's life. One of the cases which I was very keen to get to know by myself. When I was in Oslo, I met leaders of Ukrainian community. One of the issues they were pushing there was getting Ukraine's history back, getting Elisiv, or Princess Elizabeth of Kyiv, who got married with Harold, the very well-known king of Norway. And it was the story of fight, the story of love, the story of Harold, who got the kingdom to marry his beloved. Overall, Russia was using that ancient story as a proof of the long Norwegian-Russian ties. Right now, the change is profound. Norwegians have named the operation to aid Ukrainian armed forces Elisiv. So the tide is changing. If we speak about memory as a reason of war, let me give you a couple of quotes from Putin's infamous article on his view regarding Ukraine, which is actually named on Ukraine, published on his website in Russian, in Ukrainian, and in English on July 12, 2021. When I was asked about Russian-Ukrainian relations, I said Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. If we get deeper into his article, he speaks of the same language and the same faith up to middle of 15th century. He speaks of the competition of Lithuanian Rus and Moscow Rus, and Moscow won, of course. He speaks about Malorossia, which emerged after perpetual peace, and he speaks of Novorossia as the South, thus normalizing those separatist terms in the mainstream Russia's political discourse. He also interestingly speaks of the Soviet Union and 1924 USSR Constitution as a time bomb, which provided about parade of sovereignties, which broke down what he feels Russia is. Quoting, therefore, modern Ukraine is entirely the product of Soviet era. One fact is crystal clear. Russia was robbed indeed. So another interesting dimension of his speech, aside of Ukrainians who fought in Red Army in the Great Patriotic War for the common motherland, is his interpretation of the Revolution of Dignity, is here interpretation of very current events. And I will explain later why I consume your time with those quotes of Putin. And the residents of Donetsk and Luhansk took up arms to defend their home, their language, and their lives, where they left any other choice after the riots that swept through the cities of Ukraine after the horror and tragedy of 2nd May 2014 in Odessa, where Ukrainian neo-Nazis burned people alive, making a new Khatyn of it. The same massacre was ready to be carried out by followers of Bandera in Crimea, Sevastopol, Donetsk, and Luhansk. So, here I quote Putin because I want to pay attention to specific people and specific aspects of weaponizing Western academia. When I was in Toronto in 2015, we were at MOOC school at Toronto University, and one person did show up, and he didn't speak much, but for some reason his assistant tried to assault me and Andriy Parubi, whose advisor I was serving. Later I got to know that the name of the person was Ivan Kachanovsky, who got notoriously known for denying the fact that people at Maidan were killed by the Ukrainian special services under control of Yanukovych and Russian special services specifically sent to aid the locals, which was later proven by the investigations. So here, people like Kachanovsky actually enable Putin's narrative in the Western media space. They provide about the so-called balance, therefore muddying the water, therefore creating a so-called balanced picture where it is not clear who is right, who is wrong, where it is not clear what to do, and therefore it impacts the policy as well. Another case, which I witnessed also myself, of a direct attack here and now. And this is a moment when media becomes the modern history writer. It was a report of Gabriel Gatehouse from BBC, who interviewed me as International Secretary of Maidan Self-Defense in late February 2014. He asked me one question: who controls you? I said, you cannot control the revolution, but those are free people. You negotiate and you move together. So he took the quote that revolution cannot be controlled and put it into the report about the alleged tortures and illegal detainments at Maidan. So this is how those, and this was inside his story about neo-Nazis at Maidan, where he found a couple of people speaking Russian, saying that they share a theory of pureness of Ukrainian nation. So he was clearly searching for the story rather than really doing a journalism research. An important moment here is the role of Western academia in Western policy making. There is a connection between the teachers and ex-students. There is a very close connection between experts and the policymakers, military and special services, who ask the questions, and the answers from the experts influence policymaking, influence decisions. Do you support this side at war? Does it commit crimes? Does it oppress Russian speaking? Does it oppress religious communities? So here, and all it gets back into deeper questions on Ukrainian collaboration with the Nazis, on the Brezhnev's policy on Ukrainian nationalism, and later policy on Ukrainian anti-Semitism, which became rather popular at some point. Here we speak about moral dimension of war. Was it constitutional to oust President Yanukovych? Was annexation of Crimea, where everybody, as one of the British intellectuals spoke on NATO Parliamentary Assembly, legitimate just because those people speak Russian? Can Russia take Crimea? Did Ukrainian side commit crimes of war? And all of this, if you follow the Russian, the website of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there's quite a few historical or pseudo-historical writings on their vision on Holodomor, on the vision on Ukrainian nationalists, etc. There is an important dimension of psychological warfare in what is taking part in the space of memory wars. One graffiti on the wall of Maidan, when it is used as a picture of the whole protest, as Gabriel Gatehouse did numerous times in his report, distorts the picture and directly influences millions. Here, we also should speak about informational warfare element. Russian media very keen to quote that opinion, and again, repeating myself, the so-called balance in Western media is a quite popular way for the Russian narratives, like Mr. Putin's, to be brought through Ivan Kachanovsky's words. Let me conclude. Memory wars target very intimate and very important part of the person, of the identity, of the deep understanding of what is right and what is wrong. And therefore, with the depth of 1,000 years, it is weaponized now, it is weaponized today. And as you see from the first quotes, geopolitics is influenced by the school teacher of those people. I will finalize with a quote from George Bush Sr. of his speech in Kyiv in mid-August of 1991. United States will never support suicidal nationalism, and we fully support democratic Soviet Union. I suggest now it's a high time to get rid of chicken Kyiv thinking in the global and specifically in Western academia and in media. Russia is an empire. Empires collapse. So it's time to reshape our thinking and to leave the old narratives of the imperial inertia in that sphere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I understood that you would actually go global on us and would be able to give us a yeah. Thank you for giving us that wonderfully sort of global approach to essentially the problem of the memory wars. And I knew that you would put this in this sort of much larger parameter parameters that we need for the discussion. I'm going to open up to one or two questions because we're running a little bit out of time. Or I could also address one question to Ostap. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question of Ostap, our first speaker? Yes.
Agreed. I was in Kyiv when that Great Chicken Cave speech was given, and it really was not received well back then. However, it has persisted. But in order to change that framework, you have to convince literally thousands of academics, policy experts, journalists that they were wrong for years, for decades, and currently now in their professions. What do you suggest? What are ways that such a framework can be changed? Immediately in the sense of what can the Ukrainian government do? Creating, in my humble opinion, much more active and massive disinformation smackdowns in a very accessible language so that people can get online and read why this is wrong. Ukraine, in my humble opinion again, as a government, needs to fight back and not expect foreign academicians, journalists, teachers, analysts to change first. Thoughts?
Yeah, can I respond?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, in fact, that's what we're hoping.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, you are completely right. The scope is enormous. And even more, there are thousands and thousands of academics, the Sovietologists who later turned Russist, who thought that knowing Russian is enough to be an expert on Ukraine as well. And for those people who have a long legacy of their own, their writings, it would mean, if they are ready to be intellectually honest, it would mean that they would have to decline a big part of their academic work and their academic life. One of my friends said that with Global South, it is even more tricky. A Cuban professor said that if we would have to accept your Ukrainian truth, we would have to rewrite our own history. So the scope is enormous, and the scope is both quantity and the quality, the responsibility of people to decolonize their own view on history. And the problem is that many of those who support Russian position are actually working from the anti-colonial paradigm. Anyway, the dynamics of the growth of Ukrainian studies worldwide. On the 33rd year of Ukrainian independence, when Ukrainian state finally starts systematically working with them through Ukrainian Institute, I hope in 20 to 30 years we will have a different picture. Also, I do hope that new diaspora, which unfortunately will not be back, and I speak of millions of people who left Ukraine at times of war, will still produce a specific wave of interest to the new people of Germany, Poland, Portugal, Spain, Canada, and will change the narrative and the official discourse. And of course, a couple of memory wars are to be fought still in some very high level German, French, and American universities.
Yes, we're done.
Greetings, Ostap. Вітаємо з Америки, вас у Києві. І бажаємо вам спокійного неба сьогодні і майбутніх днях. Let me ask the question in English. I'll change it around. Let's take a little bit of blame ourselves as Ukrainians. During the period of independence since 1991, in your view, has Ukraine as a state and its government and its leadership done enough to assert the Ukrainian narrative, the Ukrainian sense of what our history has been about? Let me give one glaring example. 22nd of January, 1918. Even today, after Poroshenko, after Yushchenko, the big date still remains 24th of August, which for those of us who were born in the diaspora was the reestablishment, the reaffirmation of Ukrainian independence. And by just seeing the 22nd of January as the day of union, something that happened was proclaimed a year later and couldn't have happened if we hadn't had the 22nd of January. This allows, Putin to come out with his farcical comments about Lenin being the founder of modern Ukraine. Why is it that we have so many other dates now being offered as the day of Ukrainian sovereignty, the day of Ukrainian statehood? Why don't we get back to basics and say 22nd of January was the first attempt in modern Ukrainian history to establish an independent democratic Ukrainian state? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. First and foremost, Ukraine did not really have a big global footprint when it became independent. Aside of the countries where Ukrainian diaspora was outspoken and present, such as US, Canada, and to less extent European countries, Australia, and Argentina, Brasilia, and others, Ukraine could not really bring the issue of its longevity, of its continuity, and of its existence as the ancient country, ancient nation, and probably more modern state. Yes, it was Yushchenko who first tried to build Ukrainian identity from global identity from the trauma of Holodomor. Before that, it was, of course, Chernobyl, which defined Ukraine globally. Yes, it was a problem of Ukrainian politicians who directed Ukraine, who were not keen of the role of the legacy of history of its influence on the role of the country on the global stage. Right now, it's changing, but we are still not there. And even though history is returning by means of weapons when the battles are fought in important historical places, Bakhmut, an old Cossack city. When we speak about places like Tokmak, they also have important layer of Ukrainian identity going hundreds and hundreds of years into the past. I think that diaspora did more than it could, returning the kleynots, the symbols of the continuity of Ukrainian state in exile, doing it in 1992. I think the elites were not ready because they were post-communist and they wanted to be the founding fathers in a way. And they were not ready to face the legacy and the responsibility with it. So as soon as Ukrainian elites become more responsible, a bigger attention to history will be there, because history is also a source of strength. It's one thing when you come from the 30 years old country, and it's the second thing when you come from the state with thousands of years of traditions. I hope I answered the question.
Actually, yes, thank you, Ostap, you did, and actually, I'm gonna have to finish it here, but I just wanted as a secondary comment to Bogdan's, it wasn't just about our holidays. The funny part is that, and Yuko, I'm going to be pushing your book at this point with Vietrovich, but the fact that there's all this material that did start coming out in Ukraine in the last 30 years, there was a lot of information that would have helped us. I mean, we have our diaspora, where a political diaspora leadership, were people who were in the cassette. They were, they were in the Nazi concentration camps as political prisoners, and somehow a lot of that just didn't make it out. And the Ukrainian government, even if you say, let's say, a Kuchma regime or a Kryvdyk regime might not have taken it, but Yushchenko or Poroshenko, for that matter, even Zelensky thing, knowing how vital it is to get the history right, our institutions, Ostap, should have, and in fact, your institution, which is the Kyiv Monologue, should be at the forefront, because, and I think you guys are beginning to do that. You should be at the forefront of really stressing, getting us the material, because the diaspora can do just so much. But one of the things that ever was thrown at us in the old days was that you can't do about the Holodomor because you don't have the resources, you don't have the information. Well, we now have the information, and we need it from you guys, and we need it in both the Yuki language and in the English language. You have a pretty good command of the English language. So I'm sorry that I took this much time. I'm breaking my own regime, but I think this is what Bogdan was talking about generally, and what Ircha has actually commented on as well. Ostap, I thank you for taking all the time. I know that you're extremely busy now, and you're making this transition, and you're still in you're in the Ukrainian armed forces. So having taken this time, thank you very much. And as everybody says, stay safe in Kyiv right now. Okay.
Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
I apologize, maybe because of the noise out here, that I actually take way too much time to do some of these things. But let me get to the very next session almost immediately, and that is the panel discussion session. I want to thank Ostap. I wanted to thank Ostap because he's just a marvelous human being and really is very sharp. You can tell that British education that he got for a couple of years really helped. The panel discussion session would be the Ukrainian Russian memory wars in the realms of research, education, and scholarship. The discussion leader will be Dr. Lubomyr Hajda. I'm going to be asking you to come to the dais. It would be also panelists, Dr. Myroslav Shkandrij of both Manitoba University and now at Columbia University. Dr. Mark Thomas of LaSalle University, because I think he's with us. Dr. Olga Bertelsen is with us as well. And we will be getting two by Zoom. That is Dr. Kateryna Shynkaruk and Dr. Procyk as part of this panel. Oh, we have four. Yes. Good, because I was worried. Modest, we might want to take two of the four that are on the screen. We may have to take them on. So. No. Actually, you're all four are here. We have four spaces. Okay. No. Okay. You're more. I love you. I've seen you in Harvard, man. You run these things, man, better than anybody else. That's this. So that's the way I'm going to introduce you. Anya's on, and Dr. Shynkaruk is on also. Kateryna from Washington. Okay. Yeah, and so just very quickly to the discussion leader himself. I think, Ben, I don't want to respond to the age issue, but I think you've been one of the longest serving veterans of the memory wars that I know. I know that the Russians did accuse you at some point of being involved with Operation Aerodrome, which is apparently a 50s operation that dealt with the Ukrainian nationalists were supposed to have infiltrated Harvard and the Harvard reviews and so on. And I remember you telling me I would have had to have been 92 to have participated in Operation Aerodrome. So yeah, I don't think that thing. So Lyubko, I just simply said that I think you're the best suited to actually run this session. Yeah, because you've been there for a long time, and Harvard was a real battleground. Okay, it's all yours.
I could dispute that, but let's not. But I cannot let go unmentioned his somewhat cryptic remark at the beginning, and that is during some of his discussions or controversies among historians of left and right persuasion. I was named by one such participant as being a member of that group of Nazi collaborators that were brought after World War II by the CIA to infiltrate American universities. If that were true, the CIA must have had a great deal of foresight, because I was, barely born, or maybe not even born yet. Time is short, so I will skip some of the formalities, but I do want to begin with a small but very heartfelt tribute to Mark van Hagen, myself. We know that this conference is dedicated to him, to his contribution to the study of Ukrainian history, and not least the role of memory in this endeavor. And by the way, I will treat my remarks and possibly this session a little bit more broadly than the name given to the conference, because I think that we should be talking not only about memory wars. To have memory wars, one has to have memories. And in many cases, we are not yet certain of the memories. We are still discovering memories, learning them, studying them, interpreting them, not only our own, but those of other people. And also, as my own remarks towards the end, I will try to demonstrate, when you're talking about Ukrainian Russian memories, you're not talking only about Ukrainians and Russians. And I will, return to that as well. But about Mark, I can't help mention some of the personal connections that I have had the good fortune and the privilege to have with him over the years. One actually took place at this very forum a few years ago. It was the one devoted to the family, I think, and Mark was giving the keynote address, and I was asked to give the introduction to Mark, and I was very, happy and very privileged to do so. But more of my contact with him in collaboration was at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, where I was, as the associate director, I was sort of the academic program organizer. And again, Mark delivered one of our Patricia Memorial Lectures, which is a series that is what we consider to be the most prestigious. And it dealt with one of his loves, that was World War I, the Ukrainian military, but also he was then beginning to work on Kryvdyk, which again is a kind of a memory revival project, because when we think about the period of the, let's say 1917 to 1921-22, we probably think of three names: Rushevsky, Simon Petlura, maybe Vinnichenko. But all these other names of people who played a very big part, for good or ill, tend to go unrecognized. And Mark's work on Kryvdyk, I think, was a very important contribution of rediscovery of the other people. But perhaps the event that I was most proud of working with him was a conference that was organized 3 years after the achievement of Ukrainian independence at Harvard, called the Military Tradition in Ukrainian History, its role in the construction of Ukraine's armed forces. Again, this was an attempt at rebuilding, reconstructing, reviving historical memory, because at that point, Ukraine had a 3-year-old emerging military, thanks to Konstantin Morozov and his hard work at creating a Ukrainian military force. But there were not yet any military engagements. There were not victories to be celebrated. There were not events that could be commemorated. And in fact, Ukrainians, by and large themselves, knew very little about the achievements of their forefathers in the military realm. The conference was structured in such a way that it brought together academics and also practitioners, people from Ukraine's emerging military forces. We had 3 main speakers. Zenon Kohut, who spoke about the pre-20th century tradition, especially the Cossacks. Mark von Hagen, who talked about the liberation movement, which included the Vyzvolny Zmagania and also UPA, the events of World War II. And John Chaborsky from Canada, who talked about the experience of Ukrainians in the Soviet military and what people like Morozov, what they brought to this. So that was, a great privilege, and again, a great service that Mark performed in the area of reviving Ukrainian memory. And finally, on the organizational level, Mark was the president of the International Association of Ukrainian Studies, the first non-ethnic Ukrainian to head it. And he organized the International Congress of Ukrainian Historians, or Historians of Ukraine, in Donetsk in 2005, and that was a deliberate attempt to revive Ukrainian historical memory in an area that had been so long deprived of it. It was a conscious decision of Marx, much, I think, very successful in its time. And also when he became the president of what was then called the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies in 2008, Mark brought Ukraine to the forefront of that foremost Slavic academic organization. So may his service to the historical memory of Ukraine serve as a monument to his own memory in the historiography of Ukraine. Having said that, I will now turn to the speakers at this session. I will not insult them by introducing them because it simply takes time. I prefer to give them more time to speak. And they, I believe, are so distinguished that you should know who they are. And if you shamefacedly will not admit it, you can surreptitiously look at the biographical notes. So with no more ado, let me turn to, I believe Myroslav is the first, Myroslav Shkandrij.
Will I use this? This? Okay. Thank you for inviting me. This is an very important topic, a very important subject, and one that's going to be talked about a lot in the future. Just so you know where I'm coming from, I'm now teaching a couple of courses at Columbia University as a visiting professor. One of them is on Ukraine in World War II, and the other one is Ukraine and Empire. And there's a great deal of interest in memory politics and a great deal of discussion among students about that. So my talk is going to be fairly wide-ranging and is going to mention some of the points that have already been talked about. The first point to make is that the contest over how to remember Russian and Ukrainian history is not being played out between Russian and Ukrainian scholars alone. It's also a contest among Ukrainian scholars themselves, who have different views, who disagree on numerous issues. And also it's a contest internationally, as has already been mentioned. In Western institutions, there is a struggle for influence within university departments, notably over hiring of professors and the creation of courses and programs. This is ongoing, constant. At the conceptual level, the contest is over how to frame history, and often over terminology, as has already been talked about. And we all know that there's a weight of past practices which hangs over these discussions, these debates. But it's not simply a confrontation between Ukrainian and Russian scholars. That's the first thing. As for academics in Russia itself, we all know they're hamstrung by political directives, the threat of punishment for stepping out of line. The directives have been provided by Putin, for example, in his 2021 statement on history, but also by repeated accusations of Russophobia. These are leveled against any challenge to these, to Russian hegemony, the concept of Russian hegemony, and to these directives that everybody knows about. The fact that many scholars of Russia have followed similar patterns of thinking in the West too, by maintaining silence around the issue of Russocentrism, acquiescing to the conceptualization of Ukrainian history as part of the greater Russia story, and failing to engage with the issue of imperialism. This has created a tension, even a rupture within some Western institutions, many Western universities. There's a lot of tension now around this. Ukrainian academics have for centuries, however, tried to dismantle this narrative of a singular Russia, to change the terms of the discussion by focusing on Ukraine as an agent in European history, a player with its own identity and voice. They have come up against these institutional barriers and also these stereotypical views. Ukraine, for a very long time in these institutions, has been treated as, at best, a sideshow, often only a footnote, with the focus squarely on Russian history. Institutions have long hired only Russists or Russian specialists. They have conceptualized the field of Russian studies through the writings of Vasily Kluchevsky, Nicholas Ryazanovsky, George Vernadsky, the great Klaus, the ones who wrote the great histories of Russia. The frame and focus has always been on the expansion and development of a powerful Russian state. Ukraine was for the most part seen through this matrix. Even the naming of spaces, the avoidance of terms like colonialism, conquest, genocide, dispossession, all this bears witness to a certain framework of thinking. In Western academia, this trend was seriously challenged after 2022. The invasion has now kickstarted a furious debate around the ideas of decolonizing, decentering, de-imperializing so-called Russian, Slavic, Eurasian studies. These terms want to cover a vast field, all the way from Eastern Europe to Japan. But at the same time, they focus generally on one language, one state. Now, in the last year and a half, since 2022, a new language has appeared with terms like epistemic violence, settler colonialism, cultural erasure, ethnic cleansing, societal decapitation, and genocide. The result has been, as I've mentioned, this rupture in Western institutions. Since the end of the Second World War, all of these institutions have focused heavily on Russia. After the first atom bomb was detonated in Moscow in 1949, Freudian slip, yeah. The first Sputnik went up in 1957. The first cosmonaut was sent into space into 1961. The priority has been on understanding the Kremlin's thinking and its behavior. Consequently, every aspect of Ukrainian history was affected. Ukraine could not speak with its own voice in the international community. It existed on paper as a state, but it was not a sovereign country. It had to follow Moscow's lead by describing its own history as an appendage of Russia, and by describing as deviations from the required narratives, all these, in negative terms, all these aspects of Ukrainian history that have now surfaced. The Ukrainian Revolution of 1917 to 20 had to be framed as a nationalist reaction to Bolshevism or an explosion of pogrom violence. Stalinism had to be a story of successful collectivization and industrialization, in which the Holodomor was the result of policy errors or of subversion by reactionary peasants. The Second World War in Ukraine became a story of anti-Semitic, fascist-minded nationalists who undermined a united people led by the Kremlin. The dissident movement became the struggle of a few intellectuals who were opposing the leveling, modernizing state. And when scholars looked further back into the past, they generally saw only 3 centuries of Russian imperial rule and steady assimilation of Ukraine. Ukraine as language people were in this scheme destined to only become part of Greater Russia. And that is the matrix. That's how people tended to see, in academia, tended to see Ukraine. We can now understand how Putin's propagandists try to once again shoehorn academic discussions into this kind of framework by emphasizing certain moments in history, by using certain terms all designed to produce a negative attitude towards the Ukrainian past. Pogroms, nationalists, OUN, UPA, Azov, Nazis, fascists. One does not have to look far to see how Western academics swallowed this narrative. Shortly after Ukraine's independence in 1991, an article appeared in the New York Review of Books entitled "A New and Nasty Ukraine." I'm sure some of you might remember that. Stephen Cohen was shown on TV wagging his finger and warning of imminent ethnic strife and bloodshed. Even during the Euromaidan revolution, the Russian invasion of Crimea and Donbass, articles kept appearing on fascism in Ukraine, Nazi symbols in Ukraine, anti-Semitism, and of course, a divided country. It took, by my calculations, about 6 months, around the spring of 2014, before Western reporters and academics began to give up West-splaining, as in mansplaining, and started listening to what Ukrainians were telling them. Although things began to change in 2014, the epiphany really occurred last year, 2022. A new perspective has appeared, stressing Ukraine's agency, a new focus on civil society, the lives and voices of Ukraine's people, their unique cultural identity and history. This had to occur, if only because Putin's justifications for the war, as expressed in the essay of 2021, made no sense. It failed to explain Ukraine's amazing resistance and military successes, the astonishing brutality of Russian troops, and the support for the invasion in a large sector of the Russian population. Academics suddenly had to ask themselves why their understanding of Russia had been so blinkered, why they underestimated the power of imperial thinking. Hence all this discussion about imperialism that's taking place now. Why they knew so little about Ukraine. In the past years, books and conferences have, numerous books and conferences have appeared and discussed precisely these questions. There are implicit answers to why. John Mearsheimer and the realists have suggested one answer: deference to Russian power. Noam Chomsky's unrelenting anti-Americanism suggests another. These views from both right and left dismiss the idea of Ukraine as an independent political player. In their view, it is merely a pawn in the great game being played between major powers. And this comes up in discussions even among my students, constantly. Such commentaries are hostage, in my view, to the Russian imperialist view, to the idea that the Kremlin is preordained to police the vast region of our planet between Poland and the Pacific. The agonizing about how to deal with a declining and imploding Russia in many ways recalls the recalibration of historical memory in Britain and France after the loss of their colonies following the Second World War. Bidding farewell to an inflated sense of national self is painful, sometimes humiliating and confusing. Correcting it lasts decades. It seems to me that many academic institutions in the West, and to a lesser extent in Russia, are going through this process precisely. Discarding old textbooks, rewriting new ones takes time. And these new textbooks will clash with the textbook that Putin is now rushing into print in Russia. But there are other arguments going on. Some Russian specialists, as the journals Kryvdyk and Ab Imperio demonstrate, have claimed that Russia was also a victim of history, that its political choices were conditioned by Western imperialist aggression. Andriy Zaryckyj, in what I think is a brilliant essay, has called these historians enablers of Russian imperialism. The impact of their approach has been to deflect attention from the darker side of Russian history: slavery, otherwise known as serfdom, racism, xenophobia, and genocide. Since 2022, these terms have assumed a new relevance. Ukrainian historians who draw attention to the history of violence and conquest have now found many allies, particularly among Polish, Baltic, and other East European academics. And their voices, as we all know, have been amplified by Western scholars like Timothy Snyder, Norman Neymark, and Applebaum. In dealing with the current memory wars, I think all voices are important. They should all be included in this wide-ranging conversation. This means all voices, to my view, in Ukraine, in Russia, and in the West. When I talk to people in academia, I insist that to facilitate this in Western academic practices, Russia itself should not be the exclusive or the dominant interest in departments, area studies, and disciplinary fields. It should not be the prism through which all these histories are constructed. Only if Polish, Baltic, Ukrainian, Central Asian, and other perspectives are included can an enlightened conversation take place. This, among other things, means hiring bona fide Ukraine specialists and bringing Ukrainian studies into the mainstream. And as Lubomyr said, this is happening. Ukrainian scholars, all these bright, brilliant young people that are now in the West, are already changing university studies globally. They should be integrated into academic life. But there are other ways of redressing the historical imbalance. Russian studies, and I constantly talk to Russists, unlike some people, I talk to them and I make this point. Russian studies could emphasize its own anti-autocratic, anti-terrorist, anti-imperialist history. This is a long, quite impressive tradition, stretching from Chadayev through Saltykov-Shchedrin, Tolstoy to Boris Akunin, Vladimir Sorokin, and Lyudmila Patryshevskaya. The last three have denounced the current Russian leadership and its war of aggression. By studying these writers, one can open up a view of Russian cultural pathology from within. Why? Because there's a need to expose the imperialist anti-Ukrainian sentiments that have helped bring about the present crisis. These sentiments have been voiced by luminaries from Vissarion Belinsky through Fyodor Dostoevsky to Josip Brodsky. They've all made astounding statements about Ukraine. The reconceptualization is already occurring. Art history is renaming and reinterpreting authors and movements, recognizing their Ukrainian origins and inspiration. Cinema and music history is doing the same. Ukraine as an unacknowledged and invisible part of imperial culture is now being explored. Its contributions to Russian culture re-examined. And the role of Russian culture in Ukrainian history also is being reassessed. Dramatically, the change is dramatically evident, of course, in all the monuments, the hundreds of monuments that are being torn down in the drive to de-Sovietize and de-Russify. New interpretations are emerging, as we know, the story of the Middle Ages, the early modern period. Timothy Snyder's history is now available online. Serhiy Blokhy's books are available, and Ukraine is now being seen more as a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-party, multi-confessional history. I would also say that we need to recover so much more the liberal and democratic history of Ukraine, even social democratic traditions which were dominant until about the 1920s. All this has to be recaptured. And in conclusion, I'll say the important issue for me is that there are always were different dynamics driving Ukrainian and Russian history. This is only now being recognized. People are asking, well, where did Ukraine come from? What was the dynamic driving it? The Ukrainian drive for liberation can now be viewed not as pathological, but as laudable and positive. While the imperial drive for conquest and subjugation can be examined as a negative and should be examined as a negative phenomenon. Since the Second World War, at least, Ukrainian academic programs and scholarship have frequently reversed this positive negative sign. Putin is attempting to do this today. This perhaps, for me at least, is the essence of the memory wars now being waged, both in universities and on the battlefields. The reversal of signage, the transformation of scholarship is remaking European and global history. We are today only at the beginning of this process. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Myroslav. And now I will call on my colleague from Hurry from many years ago, who I haven't had the pleasure of seeing until today again, Olga Bertelsen.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. Before I begin to discuss Russian disinformation and Russian disinformation campaigns, I would like to just to say a few words, because Lubomyr brought some memories about Mark. I remember how Mark reached out to me when he was working on Kryvdyk. And why he did this, because Kryvdyk was born, he was not born, but he lived, he lived a little bit, resided in the House of Raiders in Kharkiv for a very brief period of time. And I began to work in the archives, in the Kharkiv archives, SBU and the state archives, and there were some files that mentioned Kryvdyk, discussed his life and so on. And Mark was very interested in this particular part of the history. So I remember marvelous discussions about with him about Kryvdyk. So thank you for reminding me, Lubomyr. You mentioned Kryvdyk, and I immediately recalled this part of our interactions. I will be talking about Russian disinformation campaigns, more specifically about their campaigns in Western academia. And in 2016, I published an article. Actually, it was a lengthy study about Russian memory politics and disinformation in the sphere of history, and how Russia systematically suppressed historical narratives inconsistent with Russian propaganda. Back then, I argued that this Russian tactics and false historical memories, narratives promote and support military solutions in Ukraine and elsewhere, places where people attempted to deconstruct and demolish Russian imperial narratives and scenarios of development. And evidently, very little changed, and more specifically, the narratives about the Holodomor as genocide and Soviet violence before, during, and after World War II became highly problematic for the Russian political leadership, and a number of initiatives were designed to counterbalance national historical narratives that began to emerge in the former Soviet republics as a result of the archival revolution. Since the onset of the Putin era, and this includes, by the way, the 2001-2002 meetings of Russian historians with Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov and President Putin in particular, it has become clear that the preferences of the Russian political leadership were to return to the governed history that would serve the short and long-term political interests of Putin and his circle. And these two approaches to obscuring the truth about Soviet, they chose rather back then, chose two approaches to obscuring the truth about Soviet genocides and Russia's crimes against humanity. First, a legal approach, and the second, clandestine approach. And in this context, for Russians, Ukraine has always been a focal point and a point of departure in any historical discussion. The goals of these two approaches included first reinforcing state-sponsored historical narratives in Russia and beyond by silencing and compromising competing national historical interpretations and the memory of Soviet dictatorship. Second, destabilizing the neighboring countries, especially Ukraine, by suppressing individual and collective spheres and spaces of cultural and intellectual sovereignty. And Putin's fixation on Ukraine has been well documented, and the discursive formation of his anti-Ukrainianism transcended national borders, influencing a great number of Western politicians and scholars. And some of them still publish books identifying Russia's invasion of the Donbass as Ukraine's civil war. So I don't want to mention names, but we know these narratives that has been recently published. And the third goal is nurturing a favorable view of Russia and its domestic and foreign policies. First, a few words about three specific Russian laws. And this is, I think, important to mention them in this context, that facilitated Russia's disinformation and its historical myths. First, 2001. What happened then? Putin issued a presidential decree establishing the Interagency Commission to defend its secrets. As a result, previously declassified archival documents were reclassified, and historians faced an archival counter-revolution, if you will. This decree helped governmental institutions, Russian intelligence, and Putin himself spread false historical narratives and Russian propaganda, as access, of course, to significant archival documents in Russia was restricted. Another document, the second document, very important, 2002, Putin signed a federal law known as the extremism law. The deliberate ambiguity of the term extremist activities extended the circle of potential transgressors. It could be applied to anyone and anything, making, if necessary, everyone guilty of something. And this law has become a powerful weapon used by the Russian government against opposition and dissent, domestically and overseas. Enemies of the people and other Soviet-era blanket terms are part of this law. And the third legislation in 2022, a law about foreign influence was issued in Russia that expanded the definition of foreign agent to a point at which almost any person or any entity, regardless of nationality or location, who engages in civic activism could be designated a foreign agent. Together with this extremism law, it can be applied and implemented across national borders. Importantly, in 2014, at a meeting of the Russian Security Council, Putin updated Russia's vision on extremism by approving a draft strategy for countering extremism in the Russian Federation through 2025. The strategy was designed to monitor groups and individuals' communication activities in social media, a risk preventive measure against color revolutions that might provoke a regime change in Moscow. Nationalism has been high on Putin's list of examples of extremism, Ukraine's nationalism, and since 2022, Ukraine's alleged fascism has a special place in historical narratives emanating from the Kremlin. And two key agencies, the Minister of the Interior and the FSB, drafted this security document, further shaping the vector of Russia's foreign policy and propaganda. Anti-Ukrainian and anti-Western rhetoric are the focal points of these laws. However, the process of regimenting and governing historical narratives began long before Russia's military invasion in Ukraine in 2014. Now, let me move to Russia's second approach to shaping public opinion and discourse, clandestine intelligence activities known as active measures or covert operations of ideological subversion. They were the backbone of Soviet disinformation operations before, during, and after World War II, and some of them were designed to perpetuate narratives in which the West was, of course, evil, and the USSR was a beautiful country with egalitarian principles and democratic rules. Yet the process of writing and sanitizing historical narratives in Russia had deeper roots, of course. The most fundamental and memorable attempts to glorify cultural mythologies in Russian history were undertaken in the 19th century by two Russian thinkers and historians, Vasily Kryvdyk and Nikolai Karamzin. Russian imperial authorities made use of Karamzin's history because it's underpinned the official historical doctrine that served the needs of the state. Karamzin created a schematic narrative template, a social construct that helped shape collective memory to fight external enemies. And this template, a concept of Great Russia, its unique historical path, and unique Russian identity that resists all enemies, were constantly reinforced by Russia's governance. At the beginning of the 20th century, a pronounced anti-Ukrainian stance emerged as a central feature of the Soviet regime. One can encounter this particular stance in the myriads of documents produced by the center in the mid and late 20s. The mass killings of ethnic Ukrainians started immediately in 1919 by the Bolsheviks and the Chekists. And the Chekists, I would say, untouchable status that has been maintained since 1919, created a dome of silence over their crimes and the history of the Holodomor and many other crimes against humanity. They are very instructive in this particular respect. The Kremlin official positions on the Ukrainian interpretation of the Holodomor, for instance, is well documented. Russia's political elite rejected the idea that Stalin singled out the Ukrainians for mass killings. In 2006, the Russian Duma passed a resolution denying the genocidal nature of the Holodomor, and in 2008, President Dmitry Medvedev refused to attend the commemorative events dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the Holodomor, which reveals the ongoing persistence by the Russian leadership to sanitize the Stalinist past. Some scholars maintain and actually promote narratives that emanate right from the Kremlin. There are either susceptible to Russian myths and propaganda or co-opted by the Russian regime. They continue to take the Soviet rhetoric about Ukrainization and support of Ukrainian culture at face value. And we know a number of narratives recently published. And if you take a look at, for instance, a narrative written by Matt Pauley, you will understand what I mean. Their lack of knowledge about Soviet and today Russian intelligence capabilities, disinformation, and subversive operations and activities in the West designed to destabilize a target country and more broadly a collective West is absolutely striking. And I will expand this thought in a minute. Ideological subversion in the Soviet Union and beyond was an inseparable part of Chekist tactics, which inspired and informed contemporary Russian intelligence services in dealing with the West. In the late 1970s, Yuri Bezmenov, who was a Soviet defector, escaped to the West. I believe in 1979, he offered the West the most transparent and detailed explanation of the Soviet operations, in which false historical narratives were spread domestically and outside the USSR to change people's perceptions of reality and obscure a target country's understanding of world and regional history. Those who study these operations observe a certain continuity between KGB and FSB disinformation operations. KGB operations were quite professional from my perspective and rather successful, while disinformation in the realm of history conducted by the FSB should not be viewed as incredibly sophisticated or veiled. We all understand and observe this Russian influence when we hear certain narratives at various conferences and forums. Cooptation of the intellectual elite in the neighboring states and the West, a routine procedure of the Russian secret services, has been quite obvious over the last at least last 20 years. Established in the late 1950s as a key component of ideological subversion, these tactics have been applied at the state and individual levels and refined in the territories strategically significant to Russia. Sadly, historians and international relations scholars are working in the United States, Canada, and the states of Western Europe continue to ignore the intelligence aspect that shaped and continues to shape social and political realities and public opinion in countries targeted by the Russian Federation. To an extent, this neglect and their gullibility invited the Russian secret services to intensify operations of ideological subversion targeting Western academia. Russian FSB front organizations, institutions that have been established in Russia and overseas and controlled by the Russian secret services play a significant role in this particular process. This influence has extended into the domain of history, and their use and cooptation of historians and political scientists has become quite pervasive. These organizations and institutions are guided by three major Russian objectives: the security of the Russian state, the preservation of and control over Russian spheres of interest, and the leading role of Russia in regional and global politics. And I would like to invite you to think perhaps in broader terms, such as power. Whoever controls the narrative or the discourse has power. And the belief has been that disinformation would help Russia somehow achieve superiority in all spheres, meaning political, economic, psychological, damage the communication infrastructure of a target country and shape the psychological profile and ideological preferences of its intellectual elite, military personnel, and population. The Russian secret services have conducted a wide range of operations to undermine Western scholars' critical perspectives and to sustain the myths about the supreme role of the Soviet Union in the victory in World War II and Russia's democratic methods of governing, and reinforced domestically through Russian legislation and distributed abroad through active measures. Russian state-sponsored historical narratives have been playing a significant role in shaping the story about Russia's war in Ukraine among Western intellectual and political elite. The Soviet and Russian secret services have successfully used Russian and non-Russian academics and intellectual elites to establish and to foster relationships with foreign educational centers and scholars, who more frequently than not have been unaware of the fact that they have been targeted and are communicating with Russian agents of influence. Groomed by the Russian secret services, Western historians have gradually embraced the arguments and talking points emanating from the Kremlin and have often inadvertently, unwittingly, become active participants in Russian covert operations, contributing greatly to the popularity of Russian narratives. Frequently oblivious to their origin and intent, they have published books and have uncritically repeated these narratives at international conferences and reposted them on social media platforms. In fact, and maybe it's a bold statement, but international conferences, from my perspective, have become a space of ideological subversion. And few, if any, international scholarly conventions, forums, and conferences are held today without the invisible presence of Russian agents of influence and agents working for the secret services, be they guests who mingle with their scholarly audiences, scholars of various ethnicities and nationalities, presenting their research at these events. The tangible archival evidence of concealment and denial of the Soviets' genocide, and I would say chronic genocides in Ukraine that historians have discovered in the Ukrainian archives, reveals the intentionality of actions and the Soviet regime's subsequent attempts to sanitize its bloody history. I would argue that it is, for instance, the Holodomor, it's not an event, but it's just only an example of this cluster of Soviet genocides. And today we observe another genocide in Ukraine. Silence and denial that are very symptomatic of the Russians' approach, provoke and escalate violence, which culminates in massacres, repressions, and genocidal famines, as happened in Ukraine on a number of occasions. I would also suggest that silence and denial are those building blocks of genocide, and only in silence does the landscape of genocidal violence emerge, and its spiral dynamics consume millions, if you will, like it happened in 1932-33. Silence and denial not only sustain a particular genocidal event, but create a foundation for ongoing genocide and everlasting view of mass killing as acceptable, even required, for the perpetuation of a particular narrative. One only has to hear a common Russian reference to Ukrainians as Khokhly, and to see how the Russians burn Ukrainian books in a Russification campaign in Mariupol, to realize how deep this specific discursive formation goes into the virtual psyche of most Russian citizens, unfortunately, something that they will perhaps will never be free of, imprisoned in their own minds. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good afternoon. I would like to say I always feel like I have imposter syndrome up here. Okay. And that I always feel the outsider amongst all these intellectuals. As an apology, I would like to go and say I had something very well planned. And then one of my students came in, he asked to write a paper for international relations. He said, I'd like to raise a topic with you, which is whether all nations deserve self-determination. And I started thinking about what I have to present here. And we went through the dynamics of what is self-determination. So we went back to the Treaty of Vienna and then the Westphalian agreements. And we started going down, well, you've got to have a common language. And he said, well, which language is closer to High German? Dutch, Bavarian, German, and why don't the Bavarians have a separate state? And I thought back to something George Kryvdyk taught me many years ago, which was how language was used as a weapon. And I want to kind of make that point with all elements of what make a nation or identity and what makes academic discourse so difficult. Because every element that we think of as ethnicity can be both a target of and a weapon of scholarship against the identity of a people's. So the other thing we talked about then, we went down to genetic code. I thought, yeah, you can actually be born with certain traits that make you look Ukrainian, look Russian. And we started talking about sickle cell anemia among Blacks and saying, well, that's a dangerous route to go. We then went down common religion. We then hit common history. And then we started going deeper into thinking, well, what is that common history? And we broke it out. Well, there could be this idea of people that everybody claims. And what harked me back was a conference we had at LaSalle back in 2003 about St. John Paul the Great. And we were talking about his relationship to everything he had done. And somebody said, well, John Paul the Great was actually Ukrainian. And I thought, well, in my background, I thought he was Polish, but that's all right. Both the Poles and the Ukrainians claim him. And then when I was in Kosovo, we started talking about Mother Teresa. How many people think Mother Teresa is Albanian? Well, the Bulgarians say she's Bulgarian. The Croats say she's a Croat. And then who else was down here? The Bulgarians, the Macedonians, I'm sorry, the North Macedonians, not to offend my Greek friends. And then I started thinking, who are the other characters that have more than one claim or people claim? So we think of naturally Volodymyr, Vladimir. Then we have also Yaroslavna, her sisters, all of which are claimed by both the Belarusians, Russians, and Ukrainians. So the other part of this, we all claim these people. What about Gogol, Bulgakov? Then we think, well, what about people like the things that we would think of today? What about things we don't like? The things that separate us from them? The first group being that everybody claims them. The second group says, that's you, that's us. So we start going through the history, and I went back again to George Kryvdyk stuff, and people from Huru will actually appreciate this. We went back to talk about the chronicles. So the Kiev Chronicle, what about the Novgorod Chronicle, the Hustin Chronicle, the Bykovets Chronicle, all of which are a fight about whose history is who. But even then we have the identity fights. And each of these have become weapons over time in saying, this is actually proves that this is Russia, or this is actually Ukraine. How do we get to the truth on that? And I want to think back to the X-Files and say the truth is out there somewhere, or quote John Adams, facts are stubborn things, but sometimes facts aren't so stubborn in scholarship. And then we go to the areas of what is the nature of the catastrophes that have occurred over the, say, 19th and 20th and 21st century. And we look at why scholars have talked about and say, well, this is because they're an ethnic group. When we break it down, and scholars try to break this down, in fact, the first book by Russinovsky I read about Russia talked about the Holodomor as a fight against the kulaks. And I started thinking, well, what are the other explanations? As a good scholar, we think, what are the explanations? We say, well, it could be a class issue, could be an urban-rural issue, it could be a religion issue. Another explanation could lie in the lender versus the borrower issue, or it could be that other schism, we can say, between the rulers and the ruled, or it could be really an ethnic issue. And somehow in there, maybe it's the intersectionality which helps to explain the cause of what we have today, of why we have these catastrophes like the Holodomor or the Holocaust. Or what's going on currently with the repetition of all the different events that have occurred since 1991, all the way up to the current war and the violations of law of armed conflict. And then we thought about, well, what about common territory? I started going back, and forgive me, I'm going to use a term we think about with Poland about the partitions and how many times Ukraine, or the territory which Ukraine now claims, was partitioned. We go back to what I would refer to as the first partition with Kryvdyk in what was that year? I'm sorry for my historian friends, I'm horrible with years. 1654. The second partition when Austro-Hungary and Prussia and Russia partitioned was currently Ukraine. We go to the third partition, which was when Russia and Austria partitioned Ukraine. And then some more political events. And they go back to 1918, actually, which I love that year. It's a great year to explain why democracy fails in the country. And we think about how the political parties on the socialist communist side tended to be pro-Russian, and how the more conservative parties tended to be more pro-German, pro-Austrian. And that one little party in between, the Socialist Federalists, which I have yet to get to Kiev to finish that research on, and how they tried to barter the middle. And where does the myth that Ukrainians, and I think our German friends outside are claiming that we're fascists, where does that start? And it may start in 1918, that 1921 period. So how that's perceived in scholarship needs to be really understood. And it's a very difficult thing with scholarship, because when we start looking at why do scholars write the way they do, or why are we seeing these things in scholarship, I think one of those things is that simple explanation that we as scholars want, or they as scholars also want, the simple explanation, one in the name of brevity and clarity, because we want this simple solution, especially political scientists, economists, sociologists. We want a very simple solution. Then there's the pressure from the publishers to say, hey, that's just too much, exclude that, that won't sell. So scholarship goes awry there. And then there's this general problematic thing, and I'm glad you raised it, that there are a lot of forged and altered documents. So when even as scholars try to do good research, honest research, we aren't sure. And there's that cynicism, well, it's not a forged document. And there'll be accusations of you just use forged documents in everything you did. So hence you have a bad source. You may be a good person, but you have a bad source. Then are the co-opted academics, which Trockenfeld says somebody over Colombia was co-opted by the KGB back in the 1960s and 70s. Then there's that fact that we live in an echo chamber that scholars like to hear from fellow scholars. I was personally attacked yesterday for something that we were going to do up at LaSalle. It's advertised out front, by the way. There's cognitive dissonance that scholars feel. And then there's just that current events and how we want current events to influence, we allow current events to influence us. And finally, what I kind of wrap up is whether we're just kind of careless, or scholars are careless in the sense of, if it happened in Ukraine, it hadn't been committed by all Ukrainians, or if one Ukrainian was involved, that all Ukrainians were involved. So the ease of explanation becomes part of the problem. And then there's all this that idea that all these kind of reinforce past ethnic myths to make it a bigger us versus them conflict. And that leads to probably the worst thing, which is ongoing hatred. And I'm glad you raised that it has to break from the inside, that Democrats in Russia have to break the cycle. It has to be broken from the inside. I want to pull a quote from the Compassionate Buddha, which is, anger is like you drinking a poison and hoping that it'll kill your enemy. Now, Mandela changed that. He said, hatred is like a poison and hoping it will kill your enemy. So scholarship should aim at ending the hatred. And that's on all sides. So with that, I'm going to conclude my talk. I did one thing about the Vatican here, how the Vatican got blamed, but secretly the Vatican was actually pushing out documents to say, hide Jews during the Holocaust. It's a simple explanation, way too easy. History is way complex. Facts are out there somewhere. We just have to find them. Thank you.
Kateryna Shynkaruk.
Sure.
Do you hear me well?
Yeah.
Shall I start? I don't hear
somebody
you,
with the
so-
microphone color again. That's, oh.
Yes, Pani Kateryna, we can see you, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I'll try to be as brief as possible, especially with so much topics already covered by excellent presentations on this panel. I would like just to briefly say that as an international relations scholar, I will try to view this interconnection between history, wars, memory and identity wars, and how they shape geopolitical reality that we are now all facing. Obviously, this is all very much interconnected between academic framing, policy debate, and eventually decision making by the policymakers and current administration. So there is a clear connection between ideational, geopolitical, and kinetic dimensions, as this brutal Russia's invasion on Ukraine has demonstrated to all of us. And it is specifically with the massive miscalculations about Ukraine, both in Russia and in the West, that it became evident that Ukraine's agency was dismissed, denied, overlooked, and it is although it is a devastating and brutal conflict, which is a tragedy, it also gives us all an opportunity to rethink and review and learn from mistakes. And so my first point would be that decolonization in the academia is unfinished business. It is still needs to be not just spontaneously recognized and acknowledged, but actually there is a need for dedicated efforts to address the imbalance. Ukrainian Institute has been conducting a research about the situation with Ukrainian centers of Ukrainian studies in the US. And this study has shown that there are only 18 centers that study Ukraine, not exclusively, but within the regional frameworks. 10 of those focus on linguistics. not to downplay in any way the importance of language and culture studies. Obviously, when we speak about rethinking Russia's role as a great power, rethinking Russia's taking place of the whole Soviet Union in the mental map of academics and policymakers, obviously there is a need for reviewing this imbalance in terms of geopolitical framing and in terms of framing of academic programs studying the region, which oftentimes is labeled as Russia and Eurasia, or Russia and Eastern Europe centers, so on and so forth. So my second point is therefore is this Russocentric view is based on the distorted epistemological hierarchies that have exposed themselves as irrelevant and inaccurate, specifically with Russia's invasion. My third point would be is that it is the dominance of Russia perspective and this recognition of Russia as a great power in the academia. It ended up with, I would say, disproportionate legitimacy of viewing the countries that emerged after the end of the Cold War outside of Russia as some sort of a periphery or even sphere of influence, as the hardcore realists would claim. And not seeing Ukraine and Central and Eastern European countries as actors, as agents, directly affected the policy debate about the region. That actually led to the emergence of the security vacuum in Eastern Europe, the so-called security gray zone, that we actually now see as one of the major factors leading to this war. So I would like to speak a little bit more about this emergence of the security gray zone in Eastern Europe as actually an illustration of denying agency to the countries that emerged after the end of the Cold War between Moscow and Brussels, so to speak in imperial terms. So first of all, denuclearization in 1990s was again a pressure from big powers, including on Ukraine, to give up its nuclear security umbrella without offering, as we all have seen eventually, any significant protection, security umbrella of equal standing. Then again, with Russia having a say and Russia first policies in Brussels and Washington, Eastern European countries, specifically Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, if we look at it from the EU perspective of Eastern Partnership initiatives, they were all left outside of the enlargement policies of European Union and NATO without actually taking into consideration what they want, but primarily listening to what Russia wants. And in parallel to that, obviously, the identity wars have been taking place with Orange Revolution in Ukraine bringing to power Yushchenko, who I think Ostap already mentioned, started the rethinking of Ukraine's identity also from the perspective of history memory. And Russia, what seemed back then overreacted, but now it totally looks as a logical continuation of its zero-sum policies towards Ukraine in terms of identity, and now, as we see, in terms of physical existence. By zero-sum approach, I mean that for Russia, Ukraine identity has never been really recognized, neither in cultural nor political terms. And it is also quite complicated mix of national and imperial claims, because unlike, for instance, other post-Soviet nations, Ukraine was seen not only part of Russia's imperial project, but to a large degree part of its national project, which made it even more difficult for Ukraine to get rid of this attempt for Russia to reclaim Ukraine's identity, deny Ukraine's right to exist as an independent state, but also all the efforts it was making to frame the region vis-a-vis Western actors in Brussels and in Washington as some sort of, backward region, corrupt backyard that should not be seen as a player, but as a playfield. And finally, with those policies of Russia first and Moscow factor actually being one of the key elements in the decision-making towards Kyiv in the West, we could see how this distorted perspective has overlooked Georgia's war in 2008, has overlooked the Crimea annexation of 2014 as basically dismissed it as a major security threat of to the European security order, but rather as some sort of regional conflict. So basically, seen through this post-Soviet or Russia first lenses, Ukraine only emerged on the global mental map in 2022. One could claim that EU has seen Ukraine, especially Central and Eastern Europe, earlier, maybe after the Orange Revolution of 2004, and definitely after the Revolution of Dignity of 2014. But globally, as an agent, as an actor, tragically as it is, Ukraine became visible with this brutal invasion of 2022. And what basically led to this invasion being overlooked were and the establishment of this security gray zone, which could also be, called as a twilight zone, which Russia feels so comfortable operating within. This is lack of any strategic vision for Eastern Europe in the US or EU, lack of adequate response to Russia's aggression, or strategy for Ukraine after Crimea annexation of 2014. Obviously, the absence of any security umbrella over Ukraine, either in the form of some nuclear guarantees or NATO membership, created opportunities or a sort of invitation to invade. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, the casus belli has emerged again, starting with dismissal or denial of Ukraine's right to its own history and identity, when already in 2008, at the Bucharest summit, Putin allegedly said to President Bush that Ukraine was an artificial state. Obviously, to those who follow closely the history and identity wars between Russia and Ukraine, this was nothing new, but it became quite revealing for the media community, for the expert community, when it was said almost publicly. So when the essay, the famous one on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians in 2021 was published, again, for policy analysts, it was a sort of a an alarming indicator, but not for the scholars of Ukraine-Russia relations, which was again just reconfirmation of what we have been hearing for decades. Nevertheless, my point here about this casus belli that Putin has been creating that culminated with calling Ukraine an anti-Russia and mistakenly publishing an article where Putin was named as a historical leader who has taken the responsibility of finalizing Ukrainian question, quote unquote. That was actually, I would say, a culmination of the interconnectedness between the wars on the ideational level and the distortion of geopolitical reality, and then its translation into kinetical level of physical extermination of Ukrainians and obviously Ukrainian state. So my point probably would be to conclude this this conversation is that obviously all these mistakes on the policy level would not be possible without the distorted frameworks within the academia. And this security zone, gray zone that has emerged basically was only able to emerge based on the denial of the agency and identity of those countries in Eastern Europe, like Ukraine. Therefore, it is only with the review of this Russia first approach and still seeing Russia as a great power, there is no way to actually proceed with an adequate policy solution, which directly affects national security interests in the West and primarily in the United States. So basically, my final point would be that it is only making a room for Ukraine in the classroom, in the academia, on the map, that we can make room for Ukraine's victory in the policy debate and decisions made on the political level. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Uh,
Yes.
Let me just interrupt to say thank you again, and we will now hear from Dr. Anya Procyk.
Yes. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I, first of all, would like to compliment our chair for a truly sterling depiction of our dear friend, Mark von Hagen. Mark von Hagen and I shared the same area of interest, and we worked on our main themes. I, on my first book, Mark, on a theme that remained with him throughout his life, and that is the wars between 1917 and 1921. Having said that, I must come to the defense of my discipline, history, because history is not based on memory, even though memoirs are used. History is based on very precise documentation, and the field in which we were involved, that is the wars, beginning with the Russian Revolution, Ukrainian struggle for independence, were perhaps the most documented wars of that period. both Mark and I, at different periods, of course, worked on our main studies at the Hoover Institution archives. It is to the credit of American president of the future American president, Edgar Hoover, who, before he was elected to that illustrious post, was serving in an organization for relief of those who were the victims of World War I. Well, he found there, and here in particular, I have in mind Turkey, an excellent collection of documents of the volunteer army, known under the title Wrangel Military Archives. The title of this enormous archive is not correct because Wrangel, as some of you may know, was leading the Russian white movement only at the end of the Russian Civil War. The documents include information on the volunteer army from the very beginning of its existence, from the very beginning when it was under General Alexeyev and General Denikin. Wrangel came almost at the very end, and his views differed significantly from the first two generals. Well, I must say that these documents include also a wealth of information about Ukrainian struggle for independence, because what the white movement considered its most formidable and dangerous enemy were not so much the Bolsheviks, but were the Ukrainians who, according to Western sources, and that is sources of the military attachés and various other diplomats that came to the East during the First World War, the Ukrainians during this period had the strongest army. And this is documented, I mention it in my first book, Russian Nationalism and Ukraine. Once again, this was an eye-opener for many individuals who believed that one of the weaknesses of the Ukrainian movement was its weak military position. That was definitely not so. One of the reasons why it was so difficult for Ukrainians to win was precisely because not only the white forces fought the Ukrainians, but also the Bolsheviks. And if they could have succeeded with one particular camp, they found it most difficult or almost impossible to fight on two fronts. Here I want to mention a fact that is not well known and not well registered in history, is the fact that by the end of the struggle, or rather shortly before the end of the struggle, many Russian officers of the white movement joined the Bolsheviks because, from their point of view, the Bolsheviks were reuniting Russia. As you may remember, the slogan under which the Russian white movement fought was one and indivisible Russia, or Russia, one and indivisible. And here you can see why the white movement could never unite with the Ukrainians. Because, and this is what we see in the documents, one telegram after another, the Ukrainians are just as dangerous to Russia as are the Bolsheviks. And this is at the very beginning of the war. By the end, it was quite obvious that Bolsheviks were aiming or were following the same aim, and that is reunification of Russian territories. Well, everybody knows who were the losers and who were the winners, at least according to the way that history has been written in the past. According to Mark and his studies, the losers were the Russian officers and Democrats who were the principal policy-making figures in the white movement of General Denikin. The losers were also Ukrainian federalists and those who fought for Ukraine's independence. That was perhaps, that would have been my view too, before the events that took place in 1990 when the Soviet Union began to fall apart. However, from my point of view, that is, it is both the white movement and also the Ukrainians who struggled for independence who were the winners in the final analysis. After all, the Russian Empire was reunited, was not only reunited, but actually was expanded by the Bolsheviks and their so to speak, successors. How about the Ukrainians? Well, the Ukrainians too won, perhaps not independence right away, but recognition of its separateness as a result of the struggle which they conducted during the years for independence. The Ukrainian leaders were highly regarded by the Western diplomats who established relations with Ukrainians, Ukrainian governments, and all Ukrainian governments were in favor of independence. If there was an aim for federation, it was to be federation from below, as Khrushchevsky pointed out, and not from above. First, all the republics of the former Russian empires have to become independent, and then together they would form this united Eastern Europe, if you may. So I think we tend to underestimate the accomplishments of the Ukrainian struggle, the Ukrainian revolution of 1917, 1921. And here I want to point out that Lenin would have never come up with the idea of the Republic and the formation of the USSR had it not been for the extreme weak position that in which Bolsheviks were at the beginning of the 1920s. Not only the economy was in a very bad shape, and those of you who had the opportunity to read Alexander Ehrlich's excellent book, The Industrialization Debate, there was no way out but to take a step backward in 1921 in order to maintain the Bolsheviks in power. The nationalities, not only the Ukrainians, but also many of the others, like the Georgians, the Central Asian peoples, were trying to self-determine their fate. It was Lenin who pointed out to the Politburo that the Bolsheviks have to take a step backward which was to be temporary only until the long-awaited revolution in Germany and then in Western Europe. And Lenin, at the beginning of the 1920s, was convinced that this revolution will take place. Most likely, it would have, had it not been for the miracle that Lenin never anticipated. He was dead by then. A miracle in the middle of 1920s, the Dawes Plan that Americans offered to save the German economy. An event that very few people mention, and those in the Soviet Union, apparently, former Soviet Union, did not even know it took place. German economy was recovered in the second half of the 1920s. Had it not been for the fact, and at that time, both the left representatives in the Reichstag, their number dwindled to insignificance. Most likely, no one would have heard of Hitler or World War II had it not been for the stock market crash in 1929. It was this that was responsible for the fact that Germany and the Western countries did not recover. Well, here, what I want to point out is that the concessions that Lenin made, including the so to speak, generous gift, one would say, of the formation of the Ukrainian Republic, the Georgian Republic, and others, was to be only a temporary measure until the long-awaited Bolshevik revolution in the West. And it would have never been recognized, the Ukrainian Republic would have been never recognized had it not been for the fact that as many of you probably know from Ukrainian history, the opposition to the Bolshevik regime in the Ukrainian countryside. The Bolsheviks would not have survived. And once again, that is, I am quite puzzled by the fact that this is not being discussed in our scholarship, both in Ukraine and also in the West. The recognition of the Soviet republics was to be only a temporary measure. And the recognition was thanks to the success of the Ukrainian Revolution and the awakening of the national consciousness in the 1920s, and everyone, I think, is aware of the great accomplishments in Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian identity, the strength and strengthening growth of Ukrainian identity during that period. So my point is that, main point, that this, that is the accomplishments of the wars between 1917 and 1921, the struggle for independence is underestimated in Ukrainian scholarship and also, of course, in the Soviet and in the Western scholarship as well. Here, I want to point out that it would be
I would never, because I literally love everything that you've ever done for us, but we are now getting into a time factor, and we'd ask you if you could just possibly show. Because
Yes.
we are getting into time factor.
I'm terribly.
No. I
Yes.
just realized that you may not be seeing that we're facing a time factor.
Okay, I understand. Well, that is, in conclusion, that is, I would like to say that even though the 100th anniversary of the proclamation of Ukraine's independence has already passed, there are still events connected with those events, with that particular period in history. And that is, for example, Polish-Ukrainian alliance, the figure of Petlura. And if we have neglected the emergence of Ukrainian statehood in the past few years, very few of the conferences that we held have concentrated on that period, on that particular event, and that is the construction of Ukrainian statehood in the period that I have indicated. We discussed the military events and other events as well, but the statehood was not the focus of our attention, and Ukrainian, the center of Ukrainian studies, has not organized a conference, a scholarly conference, to study in depth this particular event. And this is something that I just cannot understand. We opened the door for Putin to promote his doctrine. And it is only the struggle that we have, that we are witnessing today, that once again has reinforced the idea of the strength of Ukrainian desire, centuries-old desire to become sovereign and determine its fate. I also would like to add that Holodomor was viewed as essential from the point of view of Politburo in Moscow, precisely because of the strength of Ukrainian nationalism in the 1920s. And I am quite certain that Lenin would have introduced similar measures. It was not the Stalin's Holodomor, as it usually is presented. It was the Marxist approach to history. It was the Holodomor of the Soviet leadership. Stalin was not alone, who would have been and who was in favor of that. I'm terribly sorry if I am not, that is, as precise as I tend to be in my presentations, but some of you may know that 9 months ago, I lost 75% of my vision. So today, I could not prepare the quotations from documentary sources that would reinforce my documents. Hopefully, that is, I will get used to the impediments with which I'm living at the present, and that in the future, I will be able to resume my concise and well-formulated presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Procyk. And as to your last point, I remember your first presentation at Harvard, where everybody was amazed that even though you had full vision at the time, you spoke for an hour with your eyes closed without looking at the text once. And it was considered to be a remarkable achievement. So no apologies needed. We do have time constraints, as Walter mentioned. I will give up my right of asking the first question, but rather than give up my rights altogether, I will just make a couple of very brief comments, and then, if we're allowed, a couple of questions from the audience. I want to make 3 points, but they fortunately will be made on the basis of one example. I was thinking, just as Mr. Kryvdyk was, who spoke earlier, about that famous, by now famous or infamous, speech by Pope Francis to the Catholic youth of Russia, or Russian Catholic youth. He spoke, I think we all by now know, about great Russia, about great Russia's great rulers, great Peter, great Catherine, great culture, great humanity, great education, and all that. Unfortunately, it seems to me, people have missed what to me was the most grating point, which is that he was not really talking to the descendants of great Russia. Anybody who knows the history of Russia, and I think we all here know that historically there has been virtually no such thing as Catholic Russians. The Russians were Orthodox. There were a few cases of individual conversions among some, eccentric aristocrats in the 19th century. But the Catholics of Russia were not Russian. They were people who were brought into Russia and the Russian Empire through conquest, through annexation, and through deportation. And when the Pope was telling these people to glory and celebrate this great Russian legacy, he in fact was telling them to celebrate their own enslavement and their own servitude. I was reminded of the song by Taras Petrenenko, if you remember him. He had a song just around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union called Ya Profesiyny Rab, in which he says that, and I am forced to glorify my own rabstvo. They are forcing me to glorify the fact that I am a slave. And this is what reminded me. So that I thought was simply appalling. But then the next question for me was, where did the Pope get these ideas? And a few days later, when he and his advisors realized that something was quite wrong, the world was not quite reacting the way they wanted to, the Pope said, I studied Russian history in school. And I think by that he did not mean the university, but he probably meant what gymnasiums, high school kind of thing.
Well, this was a statement that was based on memory. You see, that is the difference, and not on documentation. And this is why I insist, these are not memory wars.
No,
These are wars that are well documented.
I will, actually tie it all together, I hope, with what you said, because you're absolutely right on that point as well. But the point I wanted to make here is something that we overlook when we talk about memory wars or histories written on documentation, and that is very often historical views are shaped before people get to the university level and study in graduate school and write dissertations. They are formed in what they are studying in, middle schools or high schools. I was telling Walter when I was trying to develop this thought, when I think of Nevada, the state of Nevada, the first thing that comes to mind is what I learned about the Nevada in the 7th grade, which is that it had a population of 240,000. I checked recently, it has a population of 3 million. I was vaguely aware that the population had grown, but the first connections, the first meetings we have with issues, very often, even subconsciously, sit there and influence how we proceed. So I think that in
Mr.
addition,
Chairman, may I have a note? I thought we were pressed on time. I thought we were pressed on time.
yes,
We commit some very important sections.
in my capacity as a discussion leader, can just say that I think that we should be also focusing on literature, not for academics, but for youth and children.
This is academia.
Very young.
This is the focus is, and the most important are the academic studies. So let's not forget that.
Yes.
What I'm saying is for educators. It's not a subject for discussion at our forum.
Okay, and well, I don't know whether you feel the same way about the third one, but I will make it anyway. And that is that for this Pope, there is yet another element to memory, and that is he is a Jesuit, and the Jesuits had a particular relationship with the Russian state, and that is that when the order was suppressed, it was suppressed worldwide except in the Russian Empire. And it's for close to a century.
Chairman, I beg you, that is, I think it's not proper to discuss this issue at our forum. I
Okay.
think all our presentations were serious and were focusing on.
I take your point, and I will now open the floor to questions if we have time for perhaps one or two. Let's see. Let's try to make them short and maybe two, please.
Okay, wow. That's good. I actually just want to make three very quick comments to Olga about silence and denial building blocks of genocide. The United Nations Special Commission on Ukraine just put out their report about 10 days ago that they don't see that currently genocide is underway in Ukraine. So I'm not going to comment because I represent Służba at the UN. It's not going to be a nice comment, but that is correct. It is happening already. To Dr. Thomas, just a brief point. Many years ago in '91, I actually worked in Ukraine, and I have to tell you again, we as journalists have to deal with the common man. So we have to make information super accessible. And we were asked in '91, when Ukraine declared independence, suddenly a flood, and I mean a flood of international correspondents from everywhere showed up in Ukraine. And the first place they came was Ruch, the Popular Movement of Ukraine. And I was in charge of foreign media relations. And the first question they asked is something along the lines is, what is Ukraine? Who are Ukrainians? Why are you different than Russians? It was right across the board. So we had to come up with a policy of how we're going to respond to be consistent. And saying things like, well, you know, it's geographic, it's a little bit of language. None of that worked because they'll find a Russian speaker, they'll find somebody, you know, who was born in Moldova, whatever. And I'm going to summarize it very quickly because I actually don't have the full text in front of me. But in many ways, identity is determined by the colonizer who considers you to be the other. Whatever they consider to be the factors, I'm not going to, for many reasons, Ukrainian self-identity comes out of being considered the other, the serf, to a large degree. And that is, I don't know about other countries, but that is how we explained it. To a large, we now know consciously why we were Ukrainians, but to a large degree, we were told that you are the other. And finally, to that point, recently I read a book published in 1991, The Noble, the Serf, and the Revisor by a French scholar, David, I'm not going to pronounce it. And he, in his book, made an excellent point that, this is to you talking about the partitions of Poland, that after the third partition of Poland, when Russia took over the territories that previously had belonged to Poland that were now Ukraine, there was a distinction made between the serfs and the landless Poles, who are also called szlachta or nobles. And you had to have a certificate to prove that you came from Poland. And that means you could be a free man. And if you didn't have that certificate from the Polish government going back X number of centuries, that could be handed down generationally, then you became a serf. And that was what in many ways, the Russians at that time depolonized entire sections of Ukraine. It's a fascinating book. It's a heavy lift, but I highly recommend all Ukrainians read it because it's from the Polish perspective of how the three partitions, what happened, and the noble, the serf, and the revisor. And the revisor was the Russian agent that got to review the documents.
They were always behind. Yeah.
So,
All right. I'm going to have to.
Would anyone care to respond briefly
Yeah.
to the remarks by Irena? Well, thank you for your comments.
You're absolutely correct. It's nothing to add and it's nothing new. So it was expected actually. And probably, you know, what my husband is constantly telling me, I would be delighted to be part of future developments when we perhaps maybe one of us will be at these events when the Russians will be put on trial for their crimes against humanity, for their genocidal practices in Ukraine, not only in 2022, but much earlier. I hope we will live long enough to see it at some point. But these particular two things that I mentioned, denial and the process, silence, obfuscation, this is just sort of significant, something that just moves us away from this particular potential future. And we have to be aware of this particular process, which is actually a building block of future genocides, potential genocides.
Really quick, I wholeheartedly agree. When my student brought the question up, I was actually thinking, he's actually looking to get a negotiated settlement currently. And his point was really going back to why are we as Americans even involved or caring? So we came down to that really is a nod to great power domination of smaller countries. Had he theoretically on that yesterday when we talked about this, he have expanded the Russian border to the Polish-German border, the German border to the Atlantic as far as France. is that his point theoretically, I'm not sure how far he believes it, is that these nations are, it's not natural. But your point exactly is it's a domination from above. Yeah, your domination from above is what percolates up. And it is, our question remains, is it bottom up percolation or top down? You need the top down pressure. You need that suppression to make it happen.
I'd like to thank my speakers for really very thorough and very thoughtful and profound thoughts on this a very long and complicated subject. I'd like to thank the audience, and I will pass the baton, and Mike Walter, who will issue the orders for the next order of business.
Well, actually, I am. And I actually, because this was fascinating, and the first part I knew, I think that the panel on journalism is might be slightly different, but academics have a tendency to actually do things very thoroughly. In fact, I really feel very bad for Anya Procyk, because she actually was not getting the signals that it was overstayed. But the fact is that you 5 academics with 5 different, very different perspectives, including Mark, I must say, man, yours, I would have wanted a slightly different, but your perspective that Jesus, maybe we should really look at this other side, what this kid was, and you had been working. So I must admit, and Dr. Shkandrij, I, as always, words of wisdom, I've heard you many times. And, Dr. Bertelsen, your work is seminal on this disinformation question. Dr. Shynkaruk, I wanted to say to her that hers, the relation to foreign policy, we're going to be having a conference in 3 weeks from now in Washington. And I can see how that's going to absolutely impact what you folks are talking about here, treating Ukraine essentially as an object, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, as objects rather than subjects to this day. And in fact, most of everything between Germany and Russia as objects and not subjects is precisely why Snyder has to call it bloodlands, because they've left it there. The great powers have essentially left it in those issues. So you've really have clarified in some ways that this is a larger issue. As Dr. Shkandrij had said, this is a larger issue than the issue of just Ukraine and Russia. This is a mindset in academia that is rooted in so many, and I must say, Dr. Procyk, what she was saying, the white guardist approach, because that's what taught us at Columbia. I remember Mark Rayev and his crowd. That's the way they saw it. Russia was in first place. I see on my eyelids, it's shaking. Yes. And it was that way. So in effect, this problem, I just woke up, and I'm hoping that everybody else, I'm giving you 15 minutes to do a good coffee break. We are going to extend this to 6 o'clock because the directors are here, and I hope Nawrocky and the gang will allow us to be here until 6 instead of 5:30, and then we'll still have a nice reception until 7. And I promise that we'll take care of that as well. Okay, so take yourself a 15-minute break, and then Dr. Kolomeis has got a very interesting set of